Alrighty. Welcome back to another thrilling installment of Wordy Wednesdays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fragath, and today, I had plans, and then I went down a rabbit hole related to what I was planning on doing, and it turned into something uh, rather more involved. So I'm going to have to save that for later, either next week or the week after. I have not quite figured out which. Um, it'll be probably it's not going to make anyone happy. I know it didn't make me happy, but it's informative. Um, at any rate, instead we're doing some reading from the excuse me, sorry about that. Reading from the autumn 1984 edition of Interzone, the ninth issue, I believe, of Interzone. Yeah, that's right. It has a little 9 there. And it's going to be one of those read along episodes. So that's good because I can print it up here because I'm a good boy and it's blurry. You'll just have to deal with the video quality being what it is. So what was the plan? Of course, I have to re-click back on it. Sorry. I was definitely going to do I think I was going to do the first 3 and then see where we were time-wise and figure it out from there. It's not terribly long, but I do want to mostly just do reading material as opposed to the visual material. At some point, I do want to do more reading comics aloud, but I have to kind of flesh out my archive and find stuff that's moderately appropriate. It's it's tough. I've already kind of limited myself by basically not catering to the younger set, but that's fine. I don't really care. Basically, I'd probably be doing graphic novel stuff that A, I've read before, and B, doesn't have too much titty. Uh, so that unfortunately means the Incal by Jodorowsky and Mobius is probably out, as is unfortunately the Finder library, which is a tragedy because everybody by Carla Speed McNeil because everybody should read that. That's so good. So instead we'll be how many pages is this? I think it's like 20 for the first several. Um, unfortunately, you're going to see every time I flip a page. I apologize. Actually, if I do that, will you? Yeah, you'll still see it. Okay, very good. We'll just deal with it accordingly. Um, yeah. So we will read this aloud. That's the plan. Right. There was one other thing I wanted to thank profusely Brandon CWW for commenting on one of the Burning Chromes. Frag, is there a part 4 / Storytime Saturdays, chapter 67, floating around anywhere? And I was like, yeah, obviously, it's the next one in the list. It's not. It's not in the list until he told me. Um, so I go and I'm poking through. I'm like, well, it's not in any of these. What's going on? Where is it? Why is this not here? Explain. And I don't know why it's not there. So fortunately, I have been fairly good, fairly good at keeping a backup of things. Every year, I've made sure that I have a backup. I should do it more frequently just in case. But every year, I make sure I've got a backup of everything the previous year. And this, fortunately, from 2020, I think it was, or 2021. Yeah, 2020, July. Somehow wasn't on the YouTube channel. I really don't know why. So it's up there now. It's as close to edited as you're liable to get for any of my work. So there, due to how I recorded it. At any rate, it's there now. There is now also a playlist for Burning Chrome, the short story collection by William Gibson. So that is there now. That is all set aside and set up. So if anybody wants to check that out and not have a story missing, I forget which one it was. Something involving the word winter. I can't remember off the top of my head. At any rate, that's available to you. It's fairly short, but it's there. All right, without further ado, let's. I know it's ADO, whatever. Let's get cracking on this issue of Interzone. Something disconnected. I don't know what it was. Well, I'll find out. Hopefully, people can still hear me. If they can't, well. So Interzone. It's a pretty wild cover. People milling around a exploded diagram of a human brain, and it's coming out of a human's head, so that's cool. Oh, nice. That's not working. Now it is. I'm going to skip the editorial and get down to the meat. Also, this wild imagery, whatever's going on there. And we start with The Object of the Attack by J.G. Ballard. From the Forensic Diaries of Dr. Richard Greville, Chief Psychiatric Advisor, Home Office. 7 June 1987. An unsettling week. 2 select committees. The Biggs trial, with its vindictive sentence, Ipanema and its topless beaches, were clearly a more desperate hell than Parkhurst will ever seem. The failure of Mother's suspect Palmer to reach its reserve at Sotheby's, I suggested that they might reattribute it to Keating, which doubly offended them, and wearying arguments with Sarah about our endlessly postponed divorce and her over-reliance on ECT. She is strongly for the former, I as strongly against the latter. I suspect that her patients are suffering for me. Are suffering for me. There we go. But, above all, there was my visit to the boy. Confusing, ugly, the stench of purines and the excrement smeared on his cell walls indicates huge overdoses of largactil. This is the first time I've read this, by the way, so my apologies. But, above all, there was my visit to the boy. Confusing, ugly, the stench of purines and the excrement smeared on his cell walls indicates huge overdoses of largactil, and yet strangely inspiring. Inviting me to Daventry, Governor Henson referred to him, as does everyone else in the Home Office, as the boy, but I feel he has now earned the capital letters. Years of being moved about from Rampton to Broadmoor to the Home Office Special Custody Unit at Daventry, the brutal treatment and solitary confinement have failed to subdue him. He stood in the shower stall of the punishment wing, wearing full canvas restraint suit, and plainly driven mad by the harsh light reflected from the white tiles, which were streaked with blood from a leaking contusion on his forehead. He has been punched about a great deal, and flinched from me as I approached, but I felt that he almost invited physical attack as a means of provoking himself. He is far smaller than I expected, and looks only 17 or 18, though he was now 29, but is still strong and dangerous. President Reagan and Her Majesty were probably lucky to escape. Case notes: missing caps to both canines, contact dermatitis of the scalp, a left-handed intention tremor, and signs of an hysterical photophobia. He appeared to be gasping with fear, and Governor Henson tried to reassure him, but I assume that far from being afraid, he felt nothing but contempt for us, and was deliberately hyperventilating. He was chanting what sounded like Allahu Akbar, the expulsive God is great cry used by the whirling dervishes to induce their hallucinations, the same over-oxygenation of the brain brought on, in milder form, by church hymns and community singing at cup finals. The boy certainly resembles a religious fanatic. Perhaps he is a Shiite Muslim convert. He only paused to stare at the distant aerials of Daventry visible through a skylight. When a warder Is that supposed to be warden? No, it could be warder. When a warder closed the door, he began to whimper and pump his lungs again. I asked the orderly to clean the wound on his forehead, but as I helped with the dressing, he lunged forward and knocked my briefcase to the floor. For a few seconds he tried to provoke an assault, but then caught sight of the Sotheby's catalogue among my spilled papers, and the reproduction of Mother's Samuel Palmer. That serene light over the visionary meadows, the boughs of the oaks like windows of stained glass in the cathedral of heaven, together appeared to calm him. He gazed at me in an uncanny way, bowing as if he assumed that I was the painter. Later, in the governor's office, we came to the real purpose of my visit. The months of disruptive behavior have exhausted everyone, but above all they are terrified of an escape and a second attack on HMQ. Nor would it help the Atlantic Alliance if the U.S. President were assassinated by a former inmate of a British mental hospital. Henson and the resident medical staff, with the encouragement of the Home Office, are keen to switch from chlorpromazine to the new NX series of central nervous system depressants, a spin-off of Porton Down's work on nerve gases. Prolonged use would induce blurred vision and locomotor ataxia, but also suppresses all cortical function, effectively lobotomizing him. I thought of my wrangles with Sarah over ECT. Psychiatry cannot wait to return to its dark ages, and tactfully vetoed the use of NX until I had studied the medical history in the special branch dossier. But I was thinking of the boy's eyes as he gazed on that dubious Palmer. The assassination attempt. In 1982, during the state visit of President Reagan to the United Kingdom, an unsuccessful aerial attack was made upon the royal family and their guest at Windsor Castle. Soon after the President and Mrs. Reagan arrived by helicopter, a miniature glider was observed flying across the home park in a northwesterly direction. The craft, a primitive hang glider, was soaring at a height of some 120 feet, on a course that would have carried it over the walls of the castle. However, before the Special Branch and Secret Service marksmen could fire upon the glider, it became entangled in the aerials above the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore House and fell to the ground beside the Long Walk. Strapped to the chest of the unconscious pilot was an explosive harness containing 24 sticks of commercial gel-ignite linked to NCB detonators, and a modified parachute ripcord that served as a hand-operated triggering device. The pilot was taken into custody, and no word of this presumed assassination attempt was released to the public or to the presidential party. HMQ alone was informed, which may explain Her Majesty's impatience with the President when, on horseback, he paused to exchange banter with a large group of journalists. The pilot was never charged or brought to trial, but detained under the Mental Health Acts of the Home Office Observation Unit at Springfield Hospital. He was a 24-year-old former video games programmer and failed Jesuit novice named Matthew Young. For the past 8 months he had been living in a lock-up garage behind a disused Baptist church in Highbury, North London, where he had constructed his flying machine. Squadron leader D.H. Walsh of the RAF Museum, Hendon, identified the craft as an exact replica of a glider designed by the 19th century aviation pioneer Otto Lilienthal. Later research showed that the glider was the craft in which Lilienthal met his death in 1896. Fellow residents in the lock-up garages, former girlfriends of the would-be assassin and his probation officer, all witnessed his construction of the glider during the spring of 1982. However, how he launched this antique machine, the nearest high ground is the Heathrow Control Tower, 5 miles to the east, or remained airborne for his flight across the home park, is a mystery to this day. Later, in the interview cell, the boy sat safely handcuffed between his 2 wardens. The bruised and hyperventilating figure had been replaced by a docile youth resembling a reformed skinhead who had miraculously seen the light. Only the eerie smile which he turned upon me so obligingly reminded me of the glider and the harness packed with explosive. As always, he refused to answer any questions put to him, and we sat in silence broken only by his whispered refrain. Ignoring these cryptic mutterings, I studied a list of those present at Windsor Castle. President Reagan, H.M. the Queen, Mrs. Reagan, Prince Philip, Prince Charles, Princess Diana, the U.S. Ambassador, Mr. Billy Graham, Apollo astronaut Colonel Tom Stamford, Mr. Henry Ford III, Mr. James Stewart, the presidents of Heinz, IBM, and Lockheed Aircraft, and assorted congressmen, military and naval attachés, State Department and CIA proconsuls, Lord Delfont, Mr. Eric Morecambe, Mr. Andrew Lloyd Webber, Miss Joanna Lumley. In front of Young, on the table between us, I laid out the photographs of President Reagan, the Queen, Prince Philip, Charles, and Diana. He showed not a flicker. Oh, sorry. He showed not a flicker of response, leaned forward, and with his scarred chin, nudged the Sotheby's catalogue from my open briefcase. He held the Palmer reproduction to his left shoulder, obliquely smiling his thanks. Sly and disingenuous, he was almost implying that I was his accomplice. I remembered how very manipulative such psychopaths could be. Myra Hindley, Brady, and Mary Bell had convinced various naive and well-meaning souls of their religious conversions. Without thinking, I drew the last photograph from the dossier. Colonel Stamford, in his white spacesuit, floating free above a spacecraft during an orbital flight. The chanting stopped. I heard Young's heels strike the metal legs of his chair as he drew back involuntarily. A focal seizure of the right hand rattled his handcuff. He stared at the photograph, but the gaze of his eyes was far beyond the cell around us, and I suspected that he was experiencing a warning aura before an epileptic attack. With a clear shout to us all, he stiffened in his chair and slipped to the floor in a grand mal. As his head hammered the warder's feet, I realized that he had been chanting not Aru Akbar, but Astro-Naut. Astro-Naut? Matthew Young, The Personal History of a Psychopath. So, what is known of the boy? The Special Branch investigators assembled a substantial dossier on this deranged young man. Born 1958, Abu Dhabi, father manager of Amoco desalination plant. Childhood in the Gulf area, Alaska and Aberdeen. Educational misfit with suspected petit mal epilepsy, but attended Strathclyde University for 2 terms in 1975, computer sciences course. Joined Workers' Revolutionary Party 1976, arrested outside U.S. Embassy, London, during anti-nuclear demonstration. Worked as scaffolder and painter, Jodrell Bank Radio Observatory, 1977. Prosecuted for malicious damage to reflector dish. Jesuit novice, St. Francis Xavier Seminary, Dundalk, 1978. Expelled after 3 weeks for sexual misconduct with mother of fellow novice. Fined for being drunk and disorderly during Sculpture in the Space Age exhibition at Serpentine Gallery, London. Video games programmer, Virgin Records, 1980. Operated pirate radio station attempting to jam transmissions from Space Shuttle, prosecuted by British Telecom. Registered private patents on video games Target Apollo and Shuttle Attack, 1981. Numerous convictions for assault, possession of narcotics, dangerous driving, unemployment benefit frauds, disturbances of the peace. 1982, privately published his Cosmological Testament, a Blakean farrago of nature mysticism, apocalyptic fantasy, and pseudo-mathematical proofs of the non-existence of space-time. All in all, a classic delinquent, with that history of messianic delusions and social maladjustment found in regicides throughout history. The choice of Mr. Reagan reflects the persistent appeal of the theme of presidential assassination, which seems to play on the edgy dreams of so many lonely psychopaths. Invested in the President of the United States, the world's most powerful leader, are not only the full office and authority of the temporal world, but the very notion of existence itself, of the continuum of time and space which encloses the assassin as much as his victim. Like the disturbed child seeking to destroy everything in its nursery, the assassin is trying to obliterate those images of himself which he identifies with his perception of the Wow. Let's try that from the top. Like the disturbed child seeking to destroy everything in its nursery, the assassin is trying to obliterate those images of himself which he identifies with his perception of the external universe. Suicide would leave the rest of existence intact, and it is the notion of existence, incarnated in the person of the president, that is the assassin's true target. The Dream of Death by Air. In the second fall, their attempt to escape from their home planet, the peoples of the Earth invite their planetary death, choosing a zero gravity of a false space and time, recapitulating in their weightlessness the agony of the first fall of man. Cosmological Testament, Book 1. The Dream of Death by Water. The sea is an exposed cerebral cortex, the epidermis of a sleeping giant whom the Apollo and Skylab astronauts will awake with their splashdowns. All the peoples of the planet will walk, fly, entrain for the nearest beach. They will ride rapids, endure hardships, abandon continents, until they at last stand together on the terminal shore of the world, then step forward. Cosmological Testament, Book 3. The Dream of Death by Earth. The most sinister and dangerous realms are those devised by man during his inward colonizing of his planet, applying the dreams of a degenerate outer space to his inner world. Warrens, dungeons, fortifications, bunkers, oubliettes, underground garages, tunnels of every kind that riddle his mind like maggots through the brains of a corpse. Cosmological Testament, Book 7. A curious volume, certainly, but no hint of a dream of death by fire, and no suggestion of Reagan, nor of Her Majesty Princess Diana, Mrs. Thatcher. The Escape Engine, The Ames Room, 14 October 1987. The boy has escaped. An urgent call this morning from Governor Henson. I flew up to Daventry immediately in the crowded Home Office helicopter. Matthew Young has vanished in what must be one of the most ingenious escape attempts ever devised.
The governor and his staff were in a disoriented state when I arrived. Henson paced around his office, pressing his hands against the bookshelves and rearranging the furniture, as if not trusting its existence. Home Office and Special Branch people were everywhere, but I managed to calm Henson and piece together the story. Since my previous visit, they had relaxed Young's regime. Mysteriously, the Samuel Palmer illustration in Sotheby's catalogue had somehow calmed him. He no longer defaced his cell walls, volunteered to steam hose them himself, and had pinned the Palmer above his bunk, gazing at it as if it were a religious icon. If only it were a Keating, the old rogue would have been delighted. As it happens, Keating's reputation as a faker may have given Young his plan for escape. Young declined to enter the exercise yard. The high British telecom aerials clearly unsettled him, so Henson arranged for him to use the prison chapel as a recreation room. Here the trouble began, as became clear when the governor showed me into the chapel, a former private cinema furnished with pews, altar, pulpit, etc. For reasons of security, the doors were kept locked, and warders on duty kept their eyes on Young by glancing through the camera slit in the projection room. As a result, the warders saw the interior of the chapel from one perspective only. Young had cunningly taken advantage of this, rearranging the pews, pulpit, and altar table to construct what in effect was an Ames room. Adelbert Ames, Jr., the American psychologist, devised a series of trick rooms which seemed entirely normal when viewed through a peephole, but were in fact filled with unrelated fragments of furniture and ornaments. Young's version of the Ames room was far more elaborate. The cross and brass candelabra appeared to stand on the altar table, but actually hung in mid-air 10 feet away, suspended from the ceiling on lengths of cotton teased from his overalls. The pews had been raised on piers of prayer books and Bibles to create the illusion of an orderly nave. But once we left the projection room and entered the chapel, we saw that the pews formed a stepped ramp that climbed to the ventilation grill behind the altar table. The warders, glancing through the camera slit in the projection room, had seen Young apparently on his knees before the cross, when in fact he had been sitting on the topmost pew in the ramp, loosening the bolts around the metal grill. Oh, that's awesome. It's a tad impossible to credit, but it's awesome. Henson was appalled by Young's escape, but I was impressed by the cleverness of this optical illusion. Like Henson, the Home Office inspectors were certain that another assassination attempt might be made upon Her Majesty. However, as we gazed at that bizarre chapel, something convinced me that the Queen and the President were not in danger. On the shabby wall behind the altar, Young had pinned a dozen illustrations of the American and Russian space programs, taken from newspapers and popular magazines. All the photographs of the astronauts had been defaced, the Skylab and shuttlecraft marked with obscene graffiti. The boy had prayed to the astronauts, but I could guess his prayers. He had constructed a black chapel, which at the same time was a complex escape device that would set him free, not merely from Daventry, but from the threat posed by the astronauts and from that far larger prison whose walls are those of space itself. The Astro Messiah. Colonel Thomas Jefferson Stamford, USAF, retired. Born 1931, Brigham City, Utah. Eagle Scout, 1945. B.S. in Physics, Caltech, 1953. Graduated U.S. Air Force Academy, 1957. Served Vietnam, 1964 to 69. Enrolled NASA, 1970. Deputy Ground Controller, Skylab 3. 1974, rumored commander of secret Apollo 20 mission to the moon, which landed remote-controlled nuclear missile station in the Mare Imbrium. Retired 1975, appointed vice president, Pepsi-Cola Corporation. 1976, script consultant with 20th Century Fox for projected biopic Men with Fins. 1977, associated with the Precious Light Movement, a California-based consciousness-raising group calling for legalization of LSD. Resigned 1978, hospitalized Veterans Administration Hospital, Fresno. On discharge begins 9 months retreat at Truth Mountain, Idaho, Interdenominational Order of Lay Monks. 1979, founds Spaceways, Drug Rehabilitation Center, Santa Monica. 1980 to 1981, associated with Billy Graham, shares platform on revivalist missions to Europe and Australia. 1982, visits Windsor Castle with President Reagan. 1983, forms the Evangelical Trust COME Incorporated, or CUM Incorporated, tours Alabama and Mississippi as self-proclaimed 13th disciple. 1984, visits Africa, Southeast Asia, intercedes Iraq-Iran conflict, addresses NATO Council of Ministers, urges development of laser weapons and neutron bomb. 1986, guest of royal family at Buckingham Palace, appears in Queen's Christmas TV broadcast, successfully treats Prince William, becomes confidant and spiritual advisor to Princess Diana. Named Man of the Year by Time magazine, profiled by Newsweek as Space Age Messiah and founder of first space-based religion. Could this much-admired former astronaut, a folk hero who clearly fulfilled the role of 1980s Lindbergh, have been the real target of the Windsor attack? Lindbergh had once hobnobbed with kings and chancellors, but his cranky political beliefs had become tainted by pro-Nazi sentiments. By contrast, Colonel Stamford's populist mix of born-again Christianity and anti-communist rhetoric seemed little more than an outsider's long shot at the White House. Now and then, watching Stamford's rallies on television, I detected the same hypertonic facial musculature that could be seen in Hitler, Gaddafi, and the more excitable of Khomeini's mullahs, but nothing worthy of the elaborate assassination attempt, a psychodrama in itself, that Matthew Young had mounted in his Lilienthal glider. And yet, who better than a pioneer aeronaut to kill a pioneer astronaut, to turn the clock of space exploration back to zero? 10 February 1988. For the last 3 months, an energetic search has failed to find any trace of Matthew Young. The Special Branch Guard on the Queen, Prime Minister, and senior cabinet members has been tightened, and several of the royals have been issued with small pistols. One hopes that they will avoid injuring themselves or each other. Already, the disguised fashion accessory holster worn by Princess Diana has inspired a substantial copycat industry, and London is filled with young women wearing stylized codpieces. None of them realize why, like cast members from a musical version of The Gunfight at the OK Corral. The boy's former girlfriends and surviving relatives, his probation officer and fellow programmers at Virgin Records, have been watched and/or interrogated. A few suspected sightings have occurred. In November, an eccentric young man in the leather gaiters and antique costume of a World War I aviator enrolled for a course of lessons at Elstree Flying School, only to suffer an epileptic seizure after the first takeoff. Hundreds of London Underground posters advertising Colonel Stamford's Easter rally at Earl's Court have been systematically defaced. At Pinewood Studios, an arsonist has partially destroyed the sets for the $100 million budget science fiction films The Revenge of R2-D2 and C-3PO Meets E.T. A night intruder penetrated the offices of CUM Incorporated in the Tottenham Court Road and secretly dubbed an obscene message over Colonel Stamford's inspirational address on thousands of promotional videos. In several Piccadilly amusement arcades, the Space Invaders games have been reprogrammed to present Colonel Stamford's face as the target. More significant, perhaps, a caller with the same voice print as Matthew Young has persistently tried to telephone the Archbishop of Canterbury. 3 days ago, the vergers at Westminster Abbey briefly apprehended a youth praying before a bizarre tableau consisting of Colonel Stamford's blood-stained spacesuit and helmet stolen from their display case in the Science Museum, which he had set up in a niche behind the high altar. The rare blood group, BRH, is not Colonel Stamford's, but the boy's. The reports of Matthew Young at prayer reminded me of Governor Henson's description of the prisoners seen on his knees in that illusionist chapel he had constructed at Daventry. There is an eerie contrast between the vast revivalist rally being televised at this moment from the Parc des Princes in Paris, dominated by the spotlit figure of the former astronaut, and the darkened nave of the Abbey, where an escaped mental patient prayed over a stolen spacesuit smeared with his own blood. The image of outer space, from which Colonel Stamford draws so much of his religious inspiration, for Matthew Young seems identified with some unspecified evil, with the worship of a false messiah. His prayers in the Daventry Chapel, as he knelt before the illusion of an altar, were a series of postural codes, a contortionist's attempt to free himself from Colonel Stamford's sinister embrace. I read once again the testimony collected by the Special Branch. Margaret Downs, Systems Analyst, Wang Computers. He was always praying, forever on his confounded knees. He even made me take a video of him and studied it for hours. It was just too much. Doreen Jessel, Health Gym Instructress. At first I thought he was heavily into anaerobics, some kind of dynamic meditation he called it, all aerobic contortions. I tried to get him to see a physiotherapist. John Hatton, Probation Officer.
There was a therapeutic aspect of which he rather convinced me that... There was a therapeutic aspect of which he rather convinced me against my better judgment. The contortions seemed to mimic his epilepsy.
Reverend Morgan Evans, Samaritans.
He accepted Robert Graves' notion of the club-footed Messiah, that peculiar stepped gait common to various forms of religious dance and to all myths involving the Achilles tendon. He told me that it was based on the crabbed moonwalk adopted by the astronauts to cope with zero gravity.
Sergeant J. Millers, RAF Regiment.
The position was that of a kneeling marksman required to get off a lot of shots with a bolt-action rifle, such as the Lee Enfield or the Mannlicher Carcano. I banned him from the firing range.
Was Matthew Young dismantling and reassembling the elements of his own mind as if they were the constituents of an Ames room? The pilot of the Home Office helicopter spoke graphically of the spatial disorientation left by some of the special category prisoners being moved on the Daventry shuttle. In particular, the cries and contortions of a Palestinian hijacker who imagined he was a dying astronaut. Defects of the vestibular apparatus of the ear are commonly found in hijackers, as in some shamans, the same sense of spatial disorientation that can be induced in astronauts by high-speed turntable or the zero gravity of orbital flights. It may be, therefore, that defects of the vestibular apparatus draw their sufferers towards high-speed aircraft, and the hijack is an unconscious attempt to cure this organic affliction. Prayer, vestibular defects, hijacking. Watching Colonel Stamford in the Parc des Princes, I notice that he sometimes stumbles as he bows over his lectern, his hands clasped in prayer in that characteristic spasm so familiar from the newsreels, and now even mimicked by TV comedians. Is Colonel Stamford trying to hijack the world? 28 March 1988. Events are moving on apace. Colonel Thomas Jefferson Stamford has arrived in London after completing his triumphal tour of the non-communist world. He has conferred with generals and right-wing churchmen and has calmed battlefields from the Golan Heights to the Western Sahara. As always, he urges the combatants to join forces against the real enemy, pushing an anti-Soviet church militant line that makes the CIA look like the Red Cross. Television and newspapers show him mingling with the heads of state and retired premiers, with Kohl, Thatcher, and Mitterrand, with Scandinavian royals and the British monarch. Throughout, Colonel Stamford's earlier career as an astronaut is never forgotten. At his rallies in the Parc des Princes and Munich's Olympic Stadium, these great arenas are transformed into what seems to be the interior of a gigantic starship. By the cunning use of a circular film screen, Colonel Stamford's arrival at the podium is presented as a landing from outer space, to deafening extracts from Thus Spake Zarathustra and Holst's Planets. Of course it is. With its illusionist back projection and trick lighting, the rally becomes a huge Ames room, a potent mix of evangelical Christianity, astronautics, and cybernetic movie making. We are in the presence of an Intelsat messiah, a mana personality for the age of cable TV. His thousands of followers sway in their seats, clutching Cum Inc.'s promotional videos like Mao's Red Guards with their little red books. Are we seeing the first video religion, an extravagant light show with laser graphics by Lucasfilms? The message of the rallies, as of the videos, is that Colonel Thomas Stamford has returned to Earth to lead a moral crusade against atheistic Marxism, a second coming that has launched the 13th disciple down the aisles of space from the altar of the Mare Imbrium. Already, 2 former Apollo astronauts have joined his crusade, resigning their directorships of Avis and the Disney Corporation, and members of the Skylab and Shuttle missions have pledged their support. Will NASA one day evolve into a religious organization? Caucus leaders in the Democratic and Republican parties have urged Colonel Stamford to stand for president. But I suspect that the great mission controller in the sky intends to bypass the presidency and appeal directly to the U.S. public as an astro-messiah, a space ayatollah descending to Earth to set up his religious republic. The First Church of the Divine Astronaut. These messianic strains reminded me of the boy, the self-sworn enemy of all astronauts. On the day after the Colonel's arrival in London for the Easter rally, to be attended by Prince Charles, Princess Diana, and the miraculously cured Prince William, I drove to the lock-up garage in Highbury. I had repeatedly warned Home Office of a probable assassination attempt, but they seemed too mesmerized by the Stamford fever that had seized the whole of London to believe that anyone would attack him. As Constable Willings waited in the rain, I stared down at the oil-stained camp bed and the sink with its empty cans of instant coffee. The Special Branch investigators had stripped the shabby garage, yet pinned to the cement wall above the bed was a postcard that they had inexplicably missed. Stepping closer, I saw that it was a reproduction of a small Samuel Palmer. A dream of death by fire, a visionary scene of the destruction of a false church by the surrounding light of true nature. The painting had been identified by Keating as one of his most ambitious frauds. A fake Keating to describe the death of a fake Messiah? Pinned to the damp cement within the past few days, the postcard was clearly Matthew Young's invitation to me. But where would I find him? Then, through the open doors, I saw the disused Baptist church behind the row of garages. As soon as I entered its gloomy nave, I was certain that Matthew Young's target had been neither President Reagan nor the Queen. The bolt cutters borrowed from Constable Willings snapped the links of the rusting chains. When he had driven away, I pushed back the worm-riddled doors. At some time in the past, a television company had used the deconsecrated church to store its unwanted props. Stage sets and painted panels from a discontinued science fiction series leaned against the walls in a dusty jumble. Blake's 7, one might hope? If anybody here is interested in somewhat retro British BBC science fiction television programming, I urge you to check out Blake's Seven. It's it's got its ups and downs, but on average, it is very good. Hell of an ending too. I entered the aisle and stood between the pews. Then, as I stepped forward, I saw a sudden diorama of the lunar surface. In front of me was a miniature film set constructed from old Star Wars posters and props from Doctor Who. Above the lunar, above the lunar landscape hung the figure of an astronaut flying with arms outstretched. As I guessed, this diorama formed part of yet another Ames room. The astronaut's figure created its illusion only when seen from the doors of the church. As I approached, however, its elements moved apart. A gloved hand hung alone, severed from the arm that seemed to support it. The detached thorax and sections of the legs drifted away from one another, suspended on threads of wire from the rafters above the nave. The head and helmet had been sliced from the shoulders, and had taken off on a flight of their own. As I stood by the altar, the dismembered astronaut flew above me, like a chromium corpse blown apart by a booby trap, hidden in its life support system. Lying on the stone floor below this eerie spectacle was Matthew Young. He rested on his back in a scuffle of dust and cracked flagstones, his scarred mouth drawn back in a bloodless grimace to reveal the broken teeth whose caps he had crushed. He had fallen to the floor during his Grand Mal attack, and his outstretched fingers had torn a section of a Star Wars poster, which lay across him like a shroud. Blood pooled in a massive hematoma below his cheekbone, as if during the focal seizure of his right hand he had been trying to put out his eye with the telescopic sight of the marksman's rifle that he clasped in his fist. I freed his tongue and windpipe, massaged his diaphragm until his breath was even, and placed a choir cushion below his shoulders. On the floor beside him were the barrel, receiver, breech, and magazine of a stockless rifle, whose parts he had been oiling in the moments before his attack, and which I knew he would reassemble the instant he awoke. Easter Day, 1988. This evening, Colonel Stamford's rally will be held at Earl's Court. Since his arrival in London as a guest of Buckingham Palace, the former astronaut has been intensely busy, preparing that springboard which will propel him across the Atlantic. 3 days ago, he addressed the joint Houses of Parliament in Westminster Hall. In his televised speech, he called for a crusade against the evil empire of the non-Christian world, for the construction of orbital nuclear bomb platforms, for the launching of geosynchronous laser weapons trained upon Tehran, Moscow, and Peking. He seems to be demanding the destruction not merely of the Soviet Union, but of the non-Christian world, the reconquest of Jerusalem, and the conversion of Islam. It is clear that Colonel Stamford is as demented as Hitler, but fortunately his last splashdown is at hand. I assume that Matthew Young will be attending the Earl's Court rally this evening. I did not report him to the police, confident that he would recover in time to reassemble his rifle and make his way to one of the empty projection booths beneath the roof of the arena. Seeing Colonel Stamford's arrival from outer space, the boy will watch him from the camera window, and listen to him urge his nuclear jihad against the forces of the Antichrist. From that narrow but never more vital perspective, the sights of his rifle, Matthew Young will be ready once again to dismantle an illusionist space and celebrate the enduring mysteries of the Ames Room. Well, that was a wild ride. That one was entitled The Object of the Attack by J.G. Ballard. I've read some of Ballard's other work, possibly on this stream from Interzone, but I'm not sure. Certainly I've read a bunch of his work on my own. He is generally pretty good.
All right, next up we have The Gods in Flight, which is by Brian Aldiss. I think I have in a short story collection somewhere. I'm not sure. I recognize the name for sure, though. The Gods in Flight by Brian Aldiss. Behind the hotel, the cliffs rose sheer. The steps, which had been cut into the rock long ago, made their ascent easy. Kilat climbed them slowly, hands on knees, and his small brother Dempo followed, chattering as he went. At the top of the climb, the boys were confronted by huge stones, fancifully carved in the likenesses of human beings, water buffalo, and elephants, all squatting among the foliage crowning the island. Kilat clapped his hands with pleasure. A hornbill fixed Kilat with its pebble eyes, flapped away, and glided towards the sea. Kilat watched it till it was out of sight, pleased. The bird was popularly supposed to be a messenger from the upper world, and was associated with the beginnings of mankind. "That hornbill can be a sign that the world is not destroyed," Kilat told his brother. Dempo tried to climb up a negroid face, planting his bare brown feet on the negroid lips. He still carried baby fat, but Kilat was 8 and so lean that his ribs showed. Kilat stood on the edge of the precipice and stared in a northeasterly direction across the gleaming waters. The sea looked calm from this vantage point, one of the highest on the island. Silvery lanes wound across it, reflecting the morning sun. Further out, a leaden haze absorbed everything. Shielding his eyes, Kilat searched in the haze for sight of Kerinchi. Shielding his eyes, Kilat searched in the haze for sight of Kerinchi. Generally, the peak was visible, cloud-wreathed, even when the long coast of Sumatra remained hidden. Today, nothing could be seen. Kilat loved Kerinchi and thought of it as a god. Sometimes he slept up here under the stars, just to be near Kerinchi. Although he stood for a long time, Kilat saw nothing in the haze. Finally, he turned away. "We'll go down to town now," he called to Dempo. "Kerinchi is angry with the behavior of men." Still he lingered. It had always been his ambition to get on a ship, or, better still, a plane, one of the big white planes which landed on the new airfield, and go north to see the world. Not just the nearby world, but that huge world of affairs where white people traveled about in their white birds as if they were gods. He had already started saving his rupiahs. Sorry about that, just splashed a bunch of water all over myself. The two boys made their way back down the steps. His mother sat on the front steps of her hotel, smoking and chattering to her servants. There were no tourists, no white people, although it was the season for them to arrive, so there was no reason to work. When Kilat was not made to do small jobs about the hotel, he sold rugs and watches down by the waterfront. Today it was not worth the effort, but he stuffed some watches in his pocket just in case. "You can stay here with me," their mother told the boys, but they shook their dark heads. It was more interesting down in town, now that they were growing up. Kilat took his brother's hand to show his mother how responsible he was. The road into town wound round the hill. Going on foot, the boys took a shorter route. They walked down flights of stone steps which, according to legend, the gods had built to allow the first man and woman to climb out of the sea. Every stone was carved. Did not steps, too, have souls, waiting to find expression through the souls of man? Oh, I like that. Steps having souls, S-O-U-L-S, waiting to find expression through the souls, S-O-L-E-S, of man. Ooh. Nice bit of wordplay there.
The sun was already hot, but the boys walked in the occasional shade of trees. They had a fine view of the airstrip at one point, stretched like a sticking plaster on one of the few flat areas of the whole Sephora. All was quiet there. Heat rippled over the runway so that its white lines wriggled like the worms dogs spewed. "Why aren't the white planes flying?" Dempo asked. "Perhaps the gods are not coming to Sephora anymore." "You mean the devils? It's better if they don't come, Kilat. No work for you and Mother, isn't that a fact?" "It's better if they come." "But they spoil our island. Everyone says it." "Still, it's better if they come, Dempo. I can't tell you why, but it is." He knew that it was something to do with that huge world of affairs which began over the horizon. The schoolmistress had said as much. As they negotiated the next section of stairs, the airport was hidden behind a shoulder of rock. Butterflies sailed between upper world and earth. The stairs twisted, and they could see the little town with its two big new hotels, which were rivals to his mother's hotel. The Tingi Tingi had only 6 wooden rooms and no air conditioning. The new hotels were of concrete. One had 12 bedrooms and the other 16 little bungalows in its grounds. Among the trees behind the bungalows, a part of the old village was preserved. Its saddle-backed longhouses stood almost... yes, I mentally skipped a line, I think. Let's try that again. Among the trees behind the bungalows was a part... Among the trees behind the bungalows, a part of the old village was preserved. Its saddle-backed longhouses stood almost on the shore among the palm trees. Their roofs were no longer of thatch, but corrugated iron, which shone in the sun. "The old village is excitingly beautiful," Kilat told his brother. He kept some brochures under his mattress, which he saved when his mother's tourists threw them away. One of them had described the village. He had asked the schoolmistress what the English words meant, as excitingly beautiful. It had completely changed Kilat's appreciation of the longhouses. Not that he believed them to be beautiful. He preferred the 16 little concrete bungalows, but the words had mysteriously distanced him from what had once been familiar. In the photograph in the brochure, the longhouses on their sturdy stilt legs did look excitingly beautiful, as if they no longer formed a part of Sephora. The steps finished where the slope became easier. Cultivation began immediately. Water buffalo were working in the fields, together with men, women, and some children. A Chinese tea seller walked along the top of an irrigation dike, his wares balanced at either end of a pole. Everything looked as normal, except that the tourist stalls which dotted the sides of the sandy road to town were shuttered and padlocked. "This is where the white gods buy film for their cameras," Kilat said, indicating a stall where a Kodak sign hung. He spoke crisply, with assumed contempt. Yet in a curious way he did feel contempt for these rich people who came for a day or two and then disappeared forever. What were they after? They made so much noise and became angry so easily. They were always in a hurry, although they were supposed to be on a holiday. It was beyond Kilat to understand what a holiday was. The elders said that the tourists from the north came to steal Sephora's happiness. "They won't need any film now," Dempo said. "Perhaps they have taken enough pictures." "Perhaps their own gods have stopped them flying in their planes." They had both watched tourists photographing, jumping up and down and laughing as they watched, to see the way these lumpy people always pointed their cameras at the same things, and the most boring ones. Always the water buffalo, always the longhouses, always the tumble-down coffee shop. Never the 16 little concrete bungalows or the airport. In the market square they met other boys. Dempo played with his friends in a ditch while Kilat talked and joked with his. The weekly boat from Padang should have arrived this morning at 9, but had not done so. Kilat had looked for it from the mountainside and noted that it was missing. The world was mad. Or possibly it was dead. Just as the gods had created Sephora first, perhaps they had left it till last. Everyone laughed at the idea. Later, George strolled by, as usual wearing nothing but a pair of rolled-up jeans and a battered hat. He was German or American or something, and he lived on cheap... Oh my gosh, what is that? He lived in a cheap penginapon. I'm not sure what that is. He was German or American or something, and he lived in a cheap penginapon called Rokandi's Accommodation. Must be some sort of a hostel. Word for hostel or something. George was known locally as the hippie, but Kilat always called him George. George was about as thin as Kilat. I'm heading for the airport, Kilowatt. Like taking my morning constitutional. Wanna come along? Kilowatt was just George's joke. Not a bad one either, since Kilat's name meant lightning. Kilat always enjoyed the joke, and he started walking beside George, hands in pockets, leaving Dempo to look after himself. He took long strides, but George never moved fast. George did not even have a camera. They skirted the shore, where the windsurfers lay forlorn with their plastic sails on the sand. Rokandi himself, bored with the failure of his business, was sailing out on the strait, almost to where the wall of purple cloud began. George waved, but received no response. Seems like the good old Western world has finally done itself in for sure. For 50 years they've been shaping up for a final shootout. There's the lore of the other West, Kilowatt, my old son. The one where the cowboys ride the range. Two brave men walking down Main Street in the noonday sun, one playing goody, one playing baddie. They get nearer, and they don't say a thing, and they don't change their expressions. And then, bang, bang, the fucking idiots shoot each other dead, instead of skedaddling off down a side alley like what I'd have. Were you a cowboy once, Georgie? Kilat asked. The hippie went right on with his monologue. I feel kind of bad if that's what happened in real life. I'd say our president and their president seen too many of them cowboy films. They finally put pride before the common horse sense once too often. And this time all the bystanders they got themselves killed as well. Serve 'em right, trusting the sheriff. So I feel kind of bad, but let me tell you, Kilowatt, old son, I also feel kind of good, 'cause I used to warn 'em and they took not a damn bit of notice. So finally I skedaddled down this here side alley. And here I still am, while bits of them are flying up in the clouds like snowflakes. He made a noise like a laugh and shook his head. Some of this Kilat understood. But he was more interested in the lizards climbing over the cowling of the tourist speedboats, beached like dead sharks. The man who ran the speedboats was sitting in the shade of a tree. He called to Kilat. Why don't you take a ride for yourself like Mr. Rokandi's doing? Kilat asked him. I'll come with you. I'd like a ride.
Got no fuel, the man said, shaking his head. No power. The oil tanker didn't come from Bengkulu this week. Pretty soon everyone is going to be in trouble.
He's always complaining, that man, Kilat told George as they walked on. The haze was creeping over the water from the north, where the sky was a livid purple. The hippie said nothing. He kept wiping his face with a dirty rag. I'm feeling low. I never trusted no sheriff. Jesus. The airport was close now, They had merely to cut through the holy grove to reach the broken perimeter fence. Sorry. They had merely to cut through the holy grove to reach the broken perimeter fence. But once they were in the shade of the trees, George uttered a sound like a muffled explosion, staggered to a carved stone, and threw himself down on it at full length.
Rock Andy's wine is really bad, he said. Not that I complain, and after all, Rocky drinks it too, so fair's fair. All the same, Jesus.
He sat up, rolling himself a joint from a purse full of the local ganja.
Suppose those cats have truly done for themselves this time round. Those big political cats.
Kilat sat and watched him with some concern. There were many things the hippie did not understand.
You're sitting on the tomb of King Siddhartha, George. Watch out he does not wake up and grab you. He's still got power, that old man. You're one of his enemies, after all.
I'm nobody's enemy but my own. Jesus, I love old Siddhartha.
George gave a slap to the warm stone on which he sat. The stone formed the lid of an immense sarcophagus, shaped somewhat like a primitive boat, terminating in a brutal carved face. The blind eyes of this face gazed toward the new airport and the mountain behind. Other tombs and menhirs stood among the trees. None was so grand as the king's tomb, yet almost all had been overcome by the spirits of the trees. These tombs were ancient. Some said they had existed since the dawn of the world. But the story of King Siddhartha was as solid as if itself carved in stone. The people who lived on Sippora had once been part of a great nation. The nation lived far to the north, even beyond Sumatra, beyond Singapore, away in the other hemisphere. The nation had then been prosperous and peaceful. Even the poor of the nation lived in palaces and ate off gold plate. So said the legend. So Kilat told it to George. George had learned patience. He lay on Siddhartha's grave and stared into the shimmering distance. Powerful enemies came from further north. The nation fought them bravely, and the names of the 12 bloody battles were still recalled. But the nation had to yield to superior numbers. Led by King Siddhartha, it left its homes and moved south in search of peace. Thousands of people, women and children along with the men, deserted their ancestral grounds and fled with their animals and belongings. The cruel invaders from the north pursued them. There was no safety for them in the south. Wherever the beaten nation went, it was assailed. But the great-hearted king always encouraged his people. By force and guile, he persuaded them to remain united against everything. They came at last to the sea. They crossed the sea, thanks to intervention by the gods, and settled in Sumatra, the Isle of Hope. Even in Sumatra, headhunters and other ferocious tribes made life miserable for the king's people. While some of the nation moved into the forests and mountain ranges of the interior, the king himself, accompanied by the ladies and gentlemen of his court, again crossed over the seas. So he came at last to the peaceful and fruitful island of Sippora. By this time, King Siddhartha was an old man. Most of his life had been spent on the great journey, whose epic story would never be forgotten on earth. When he reached the shelter of what is now the Holy Grove, he fell, dying. His queen tended to him and wept. The old king blessed the land and proclaimed with his dying breath that if the enemies of his people ever landed on Sippora, then he would rise up again in majesty, bringing with him all the powers of the upper world in vengeance.
What a guy to have for a hero. Oh, gosh. What a guy to have for a hero,
exclaimed George. He lay smoking his joint and looking up into the branches of the Hariara, or sacred oak. The oak's roots had spread and widened, taking a grip on the king's sarcophagus with arms like veins of petrified lava.
Sidabutar is the greatest hero in the world, Kilat said. You ought to get off his grave.
Sidabutar was a bum, a real bum, one of the defeated. He got his gang kicked out of wherever it was, somewhere up on the borders of China, I guess, and spent his whole life on the run, right? Always heading further south, out of trouble, right? Finally, he freaked out here, out on this little dump of an island in the Indian Ocean. Jesus, Kilowatt, that's the story of my life. Do you think some cat's gonna be loony enough to raise up a stone tomb for me? No way. Old Sidabutar is just a plain bum like me. A plain bum.
Kilat jumped up and started pummeling George in the chest.
You bastard! Just because you screw old Rocky's daughter every night, I know. Don't you say a word against our king. Otherwise he will fly right up and destroy you flat, just like America and Russia have been destroyed.
George rolled out of his way and laughed.
Yeah, maybe. And destroyed for the same good reason. Talking too much. Okay, man, I'll keep my trap shut and you keep Rocky's daughter out of it, right?
Kilat was not satisfied. He was convinced he could sense King Sidabutar's spirit in the grove. The curious thing was, he felt the same uncomfortable mixture of admiration and contempt for Sidabutar as he did for the white gods. If they were so clever, how come they ruined everything? If the king was so great, how come he let them ruin everything? They had brought gonorrhea and other diseases to Sippora. The old king did nothing about it. But he said no more, because Dempo came running through the trees. Between complaints that his big brother had left him, Dempo had a long story to tell about a Beruk monkey escaping while climbing a coconut tree.
Never mind, Kilat told him. We are going with George to the airport. It's excitingly beautiful.
George nipped out his joint, and they made their way through the sacred oaks, each one of which looked sinuous enough to contain a living spirit. Since there was no traffic, the airport guards had gone home. Nobody was about. They were able to walk right across the runway, across the magic white lines. The asphalt was hot to bare feet. Lizards scuttled away into holes as they went. In the foyer of the airport building, I can't talk today. In the foyer of the airport building, 2 rows of floor tiling had been taken up and a trough chiseled in the concrete beneath, deep enough to take a new electric cable. But the cable had not materialized, and the trough lay like a wound across the empty space. Upstairs, a good many locals were gathered to admire the view, to chat and pass the time. The kiosk was open, selling beer. In the side window of the kiosk, a 2-month-old newspaper had been hung. The paper was yellowing, the edges curling like an old leaf. Under a headline reading, "Superpowers End It," with 3 exclamation points, was a report from Manila, describing how the long-anticipated nuclear war had broken out between the countries of the Warsaw Pact and the NATO alliance. It was believed that Europe was destroyed. The Soviet Union had also fired its SS-20s against China, who had not retaliated. The USA had made a massive retaliation, but was herself destroyed. The entire northern hemisphere was blanketed in radioactive dust clouds. Manila was suffering. Nobody had any idea how many people had died or were dying. The monsoons were bringing death to India. George glanced at this document and laughed bitterly. If the poor old kicked-about planet can fix its circulation system properly, odds are on staying safe here in the southern hemisphere. Just don't let 'em ship in any of that radiation muck down here. They talked to a lot of people, but only rumors could pass between them. Some said Australia had been destroyed. Some mentioned South Africa.
Others said that South Africa was sending hospital teams to Europe. Kilat enjoyed just being in the lounge with its map of world communications in marquetry on the wall. He felt powerful in the airport. This was the escape route to other lands, if they still existed.
Will we be wiped out? Dempo asked. The white gods hate us, don't they? No nonsense. We are the lucky ones. The great body of Sumatra lies between us and all that destruction. Kerinci and the other giants will keep infection away from us. He thought about his watches and walked among the crowd trying to sell them. Nobody was in the mood for buying. One smartly dressed merchant said, shaking his head,
"Watches are no good any more, my son. Time has run out."
He looked very sad. The airport siren sounded. An official in the uniform of Merpati marched into the lounge and addressed them. He held his hands up, palms forward, for silence. "Attention! We are receiving radio messages from a plane in trouble in the area. We have signaled it to land in Benkulu, but there is trouble in the plane, illness of some sort, and they are running out of fuel. The plane will land here." A babble of questions greeted the statement. Men pressed forward on the official. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair. He smiled and waved his hands again as he backed away. "Do not worry. We shall deal with the emergency." His words were drowned by the siren of an ambulance swinging out of its garage onto the tarmac just beyond the reception lounge. "We ask all who have no official business here to please to quit the airport premises for their own safety. The plane is larger than the types officially designated to land here. We may have a little trouble since the runway is too short in this instance. Please vacate the premises immediately." More questions and excitement. The official held his ground and said, "Yes, yes, I understand your worries. No worries if you do not panic. Please evacuate the building peacefully. We understand the plane is American, bringing high-ranking officials from San Diego." At the word American, the panic got underway in earnest. Everybody started to run, down the stairs or simply round the lounge. Kilat grasped Dempo's hand and charged downstairs. They elbowed their way out through the double-glass doors. They had lost the hippie, but Kilat did not care about that. He ran with Dempo, aiming for the airport fence. The fire engine went by. When he looked up, he saw the sky had hazed over. It felt suddenly cold. Someone whistled. The boys looked and saw George leaning against the open doors of the ambulance garage. He beckoned them over. They ran to him. He stooped to put his arms around them.
"Sounds like there might be a little excitement. Let's wait here. I want to get a look at these guys getting off this plane."
He stared hard at Kilat, saying, "Heap bad medicine, Kilawa." He relit his joint, his soft face unusually grim. Kilat and Dempo squatted in the dust. They could look right across the airport to the Holy Grove, and through the grove to the sea, its surface sullen, no longer glittering.
To see a plane come in from here would be excitingly beautiful. Have you ever been to San Diego, George?
If these cats survive, they've been underground. Oh my gosh, what is going on? If these cats survive, they have been underground, out of harm's way. Kilat did not understand, and allowed himself to be cuddled only a minute. But he remained close to George. After a while, George said, "Listen, Kilowat, these cats are going to bring trouble. Plenty trouble. If they survive the Holocaust and they've grabbed a plane, then they're bigwigs, that's sure. And if they come this far, like why not someplace nearer home, then it figures that some other guys along the way would not let them land, right? I'm telling you, these cats may be loaded with Marines and God knows what, like bodyguards. They bring trouble."
Perhaps they'll be grateful to us."
"Grateful shit. Cats with guns ain't grateful. They'll be looking for one last shootout.
Maybe it's the President of the United States coming to visit us,
Dempo said, hoping for reassurance. He looked frightened and clung to George's leg. Kilat said in a small voice,
You think they might take Sipora over?
Why no? Why the hell not? I know these cats think they own the world. Maybe your police should gun them all down as they cross the tarmac. Kilat looked concernedly up into the hippie's face. He could tell George was frightened. Overhead, engine roar grew slightly louder. The plane remained in the overcast.
We've only got 6 police and they've only got 1 gun between them. They're just for controlling tourists, that's all.
George looked wildly about. Maybe the damn bird'll crash if the runway's too short. Blow itself up and good riddance. We need those cats here like we need the clap. Dempo started to jump up and down.
Oh, I hope it crashes. I hope it crashes. That would be really excitingly beautiful.
The airport was now a scene of wild action. Sirens were blaring and people and cars moving about the runways. The island's one police car was trying to hustle them out of the way. Centerline lights came on along the landing strips. High-density approach lights, white touchdown zone lights winked on. Flags were rushed up masts. More people were running up from the direction of the town. Suddenly, the noise of the plane was louder. The plane emerged from the low cloud. It was enormous, silver, predatory, its undercarriage unfolding. It made the universe vibrate. Anyone sleeping anywhere on the island would have been awakened. Dempo and Kilat fell over in awe. The plane came roaring down, aiming straight for the ambulance shed, or so it appeared. Then, with a gust of wind which curled the dust off the airport, it was gone again. They saw its glaring jets before it vanished back into the cloud cover.
Oh, it's gone away, cried the boys. It's gone to Bengkulu after all.
All the people out on the airport ground had flung themselves flat. Now they got up and ran for safety, while the cars drove off in all directions, revving their engines and skidding to avoid collision. It'll be back, George said. He spat on the ground. Pilot just took a look. His instruments must be malfunctioning. Who the hell could those guys be up there? Oh, I don't like this. I don't like this one little bit.
It's the President. I know it,
Kilat shouted. He had to shout. The noise was greater. The plane had turned over the strait and was coming in again. Run slap into the mountain, you bastard! George called, raising a fist to the sky. Leave us in peace! They saw it then. This time it was much lower. Spoilers up, ailerons going down, nose lifting. The undercarriage appeared to brush the tossing palms at the far end of the field. It looked too enormous and It looked too enormous and fast possibly to stop in the length of the island. Crash, you bastard! George yelled as it rushed by, monstrous, bouncing, jarring. Grit whipped up into their faces. The scream of the tires hit them. Then it was past. It was slowing. Only a few hundred yards to go to the far fence. Both the ambulance and the fire engine were roaring along behind it. The plane juddered as it braked while the fence came nearer. Now it might stop in time, but momentum carried it on. Stones flew. Still thundering, the silver monster ran over the threshold markings, bumped off the end of the asphalt, and crunched through a row of flashers. The people watching through the wire fence broke and ran. The machine swerved, rammed a wing against the fencing, and plowed in a leisurely way through the side fence, striking its nose and one engine against palm trees. Part of the undercarriage snapped. The plane sank to one side as if going down on one knee. Smoke, steam, and dust covered the scene. "Jesus," said George. "Jesus," said the boys in imitation. The scene seemed to hold as if time had frozen. The diffused sunlight made everything shadowless. Then one of the emergency exits opened in the side of the plane. A yellow escape chute billowed out. Passengers began to slide down the chute, one every 1.5 seconds. They came down like dolls, only returning to life at the bottom as they picked themselves up. The smashed engine was smoking. Suddenly it burst into flame. Flames ran along the wing, rose up over the cockpit. Shouts came from the plane. Another exit opened and forward on the wing. Another exit opened forward of the wing. Uniformed men jumped out and fell.
"Wouldn't you know it? Soldiers!" yelled George. "The Yanks are coming!"
He started hurling abuse at the men lining up beside the yellow chute. They wore battle dress, helmets, and were armed with machine carbines. The two boys could see that most of the men were in bad condition. Their faces were pale, their hair patchy. Some were bandaged. Some fell to the ground directly. What? I feel like a word's missing. Some fell to the ground directly. They exchanged the air conditioning of the plane for the muggy atmosphere of Sapporo. I don't know. Other people can read that. Their faces were pale, their hair patchy. Some were bandaged. Some fell to the ground directly. They exchanged the air conditioning of the plane for the muggy atmosphere of Sapporo. It's all one sentence. I don't know what's going on there. Although the fire was gaining hold and their movements were panicky, the newcomers moved slowly and stiffly.
"They are ill," Kilat said. "They are bringing their diseases here. Let's skedaddle down a side alley."
"There ain't no more side alleys, son." As the fire engine drove up, the soldiers stopped it, aiming their weapons at the crew. Black smoke billowed across the tarmac. Older men were now deplaning. They walked painfully towards the airport buildings. Most of them wore peaked caps with braid and metal ribbons on their chests. An armed escort fell in and accompanied them, carbines at the ready.
"It's the fucking chiefs of staff!" George yelled. "Those are the bastards that started this war, and they think they can hide out in some damned bolt hole in the Indian Ocean."
"They have the sickness,"
Kilat called, but George was already running out of the shelter, running across the concrete towards the approaching column of decrepit figures, swerving to avoid the oily smoke. Kilat saw it happening, saw the muzzles of the guns go up, saw the faces of the soldiers. He never forgot the faces of those soldiers. They tightened their mouths, froze, became expressionless, and fired. Fired at George as he charged towards them, shouting. The bullets came spanging in the direction of the boys. Kilat pulled Dempo to the floor as one smacked into the back of the garage. When he looked up, George had fallen and was rolling over and over in a curious way, kicking his legs. Then he stopped and lay still. Even as George ceased to move, another noise added itself to the roar of fire. It was a quite distinctive sound, like a whistle, like a giant's exhalation. The ground shook with it. Among the trees opposite where the boys lay, clouds of steam billowed up. They concealed something rising from the earth itself, from a gaping tomb. A great figure grew taller. It came up like a rocket. Its head emerged above the crowns of the trees in the holy grove. Smoke and steam wreathed that countenance like whiskers, but the expression of an anger implacable in intent was clear to see. King Sidabutar had woken at last from his long sleep. He rose like vengeance to summon up the powers of the upper world. Science was dead.
Now he was free to wreak destruction on his enemies.
That one was wild. I did not know where that one was going. So that was The Gods in Flight by Brian Aldiss. What time is it? How long is canned goods? 1, 2, 3. Oh, we can get through canned goods. All right. So we got one last one here we'll do today. And then next week, maybe next week I'll have the thing that I had sort of tried to plan, and then ran into difficulties getting it finalized because it's a lot. I have to sort a bit of wheat from chaff, um, and it's not going to make anyone happy. It's got to do with AI, the current state of AI, and how it's being used in a modern context, um, specifically in a modern military context, and it's going to come across as fairly political, um, and you'll just have to deal with it. Let's just say it reveals some of the operating procedure that Israel has been doing for the last year using AI and facial recognition systems. The facial recognition systems thing is kind of old news, but they've refined the model substantially, and it's a bit of a bummer. Let's say it's not great. If you are essentially a humanist, it is not going to make you a happy person. But let's go with canned goods, which surely can't possibly end like that one Twilight Zone episode. It's a cookbook. Huh? It's a cookbook. How to serve man. Good times. So this is Canned Goods by Thomas M. Deesh.
In the downstairs lobby, Mr. Wayman's handgun was taken from him by one of the 4 uniformed guards and locked in a mailbox. No such requirement was made of his escort, whose name was Lenny. When Lenny followed him to the dark stairwell, Mr. Wayman went through a short inward crisis of unreasoning paranoia, followed by an inward sigh of resignation to the dictates of fate, followed by a brief but intense rapture of anger at the way he was being made to cooperate in his own fleecing. It was just as well they'd taken his gun away in the lobby, or he might have done something foolish when he finally got to see this Schroeder person. He must not let himself flare up. Survival was all that mattered. He had survived the winter. Now, if he could just last out the spring, the government would surely have found some way by then to restore the city to a semblance of order. The crisis could not keep going on and on and on. It had to stop, and then things would return to normal. On the 6th floor, Mr. Wayman was obliged to stop and catch his breath. During the entire long trek downtown, his escort had never once offered to help Mr. Wayman with his precious parcel in its swaddlings of old clothes and taped and stapled together shopping bags. Now Mr. Wayman's arms and back ached, his sinuses were beginning to pulse ominously, and his lungs were heaving. It wouldn't do to arrive at Schroeder's door out of breath and beet red.
Is it much further up?
14, replied the ever-laconic Lenny. Mr. Wayman demanded rest stops again on 9 and 12, and so when Schroeder came to the door and asked him in, he was able to respond without major heavings and gaspings. He even had breath to laugh at Schroeder's and all the world's little joke about having to complain to the landlord to get the elevator fixed.
Schroeder led him into a large drawing room made to seem small with overmuch furniture.
Not so much furniture that one was put in mind at once of Noah's Ark, but a good deal more, Mr. Wayman was certain, than had been here at the start of the crisis. Nor were the walls hung chock-a-block with the choicest of his recent acquisitions, as one might have expected. There was a small flower painting over the mantel, Fantin Latour, a vintage Derain between the windows, and, in the place of honor opposite the couch of which Mr. Wayman was seated, a large, expensively framed academic nude, reclining her peaches and cream buttocks on masses of maroon velvet, all very correct and not a little lubricious. From Mr. Wayman's viewpoint, this was not entirely reassuring. That nude, in particular, spoke of a taste that caters to the requirements of Arab oil sheiks. The Derain, on the other hand, offered some hope. Indeed, despite himself, Mr. Wayman could not resist an altogether incongruous twinge of envy. For all that he delighted in the Fauve, he'd never owned a first-rate work by one of them.
"Shall we," said Schroeder, "get right to business?"
By all means, Mr. Wayman. Oh, sorry, he's not panting anymore. By all means, Mr. Wayman began undoing the swaddlings of his parcel.
"I hope you won't mind if Lenny puts this on videotape. I should like to have evidence that our transaction has been entered into, on both sides, freely and without constraint, should there ever be any question."
I quite understand, and I'm scarcely in a position to object. Indeed, I'm grateful to be allowed to come here, and for the escort your friend provided. No one likes to carry large parcels about on the street these days, though if I knew I were going to be on camera, I might have dressed with a little more care.
"Oh, we must all wear camouflage on the streets these days. This is the era, necessarily, of inconspicuous consumption."
Mr. Wayman placed his first offering on the low table before the couch.
"Aha!" said Schroeder,
making no effort to disguise his pleasure.
"Fisk Boyd, a good one, though, of course, for a woodcut there is an obvious limit to what I can offer."
Mr. Wayman regarded the Boyd woodcut with a regretful love admixed with some vanity. It represented an arrangement of canned goods on a tabletop, very spare, very assured. He had bought it in '88, when Boyd's reputation and his prices were already on the rise. His prices had peaked, but never declined, and Mr. Wayman could congratulate himself, in this instance, on his acumen as an investor. It's chiefly for his woodcuts that Boyd's admired, Mr. Wayman pointed out with the confidence that comes of having the judgment of the market behind one.
"Yes, of course. I only meant that there's a limit to what I can offer to... I only meant that there's a limit to what I can afford to offer for even the finest woodcut. What is the date, by the way?"
1930. There was no need to add that it was in miraculously mint condition.
"Yes, well..."
Schroeder nodded significantly toward the shopping bag, as much to say, let's move along. Shyly, with a sense almost of exposing himself, Mr. Wayman took out what he regarded as his trump card, a large, chastely framed Motherwell collage/drawing. Schroeder formed his lips into an O of disappointment. I realize, of course, that Motherwell no longer commands the prices he once did. Schroeder emitted a derisive snort, like the erasure of a laugh.
"Indeed, in that respect, Motherwell remains at the forefront of the avant-garde."
You're speaking of what happened to the 6 paintings in the Elegy series at the Black Saturday auction? If the gallery had been allowed to put floors on the prices...
If pigs could fly, there was no one buying abstract... If pigs could fly, there was no one buying abstract expressionism at that point but museums and investors. Once the museums started unloading, you don't think the investors wouldn't follow suit, do you?
Mr. Wayman looked down at his Motherwell sadly. Only 4 years ago he'd bought it from a friend in dire circumstances for $200. The friend had paid several $1,000s for it in the late '60s. I was there that day, Mr. Wayman said. Were you? On Black Saturday? Hardly. I would have been 11 years old. It's something I'll never forget. I remember how I lusted after those Motherwells. But by the time they'd come under the hammer, I'd already emptied my own bank account, and the Zurich gallery I was acting for wasn't touching anything that went under an artist's established price level by more than 50%. I remember the silences that day. They'd have a price, and have it again, and still no one would bid. A Poons for 1200. Well, perhaps that's not unthinkable. Tastes change, and if one paints on such an institutional scale, and institutions decide to stop investing in art, what's to be done? But a Braque for 700? Braque? Mr. Wayman, may I remind you that it's not Braque's merits at issue here, but Motherwell's. Excuse me. I'm in no position to argue, but I must at least be allowed to point out that this drawing was hung at the 65 retrospective at the Modern. I don't care if it hung at the Louvre next to the Mona Lisa. It is my long-standing opinion that Motherwell was never anything more than the favorite tailor of a very naked emperor. Any third-year art student with savvy coaching from a competent interior decorator could produce such wallpaper by the roll. The days are gone when a painter can claim a day's wages for 2 minutes' work because he spent a lifetime refining his taste. I'm sorry, Mr. Whistler, but art is not PR. Sorry to you, Mr. Motherwell, but this sort of thing. He tapped the scrap of Goyot's pack that lent its little note of color to the drawing. Just won't do. Not in the 21st century.
Well, if you don't want it, Mr. Wayman said with a resentment he was unable to conceal, you needn't take it. I have faith that Motherwell's day will return. I am sorry for your sake that you do not.
As to my taking it, Mr. Wayman, I have a fixed policy, as I believe our mutual friend at Sotheby's explained to you. I buy by the lot. My overhead costs don't allow me the luxury of haggling. Now, let's see what else you have.
Mr. Wayman removed the Birchfield canvas from his shopping bag, which, no longer braced by the painting's stretcher, flopped sideways to the carpet, a very choice charouk in a floral design.
Ah, this is more like it.
Schroeder took the Birchfield in his hands and turned it at different angles to the light, as though studying the facets of a gemstone. It was a painting of a Christmas tree, but a Christmas tree seen in its eternal aspect, each light aureoled and the several aureoles overlapping and interweaving in an elaborate seine of interference patterns. The paint seemed to tremble like tinsel on a tree.
This, said Schroeder reverently, cannot be easy to part with. I'll give you the best price I can. Let me think. For the Fisk Boyd, I'll give you, let's say, an even 10 cans of tuna. No, it's in mint condition. Let's make it a round dozen. For the Motherwell, a pound of elbow macaroni, which is more than it's worth. For the Birchfield...
He took the small canvas to the window and basked in the glory of its beauty.
For the Birchfield, I shall let Lenny take you to the stockroom, and you may fill up one plastic carrier bag with whatever you fancy, excepting only the caviar. There's a limit of 3 jars per customer on that.
That's very good of you, Mr. Schroeder. Very generous indeed. Thank you. Mr. Wayman reached for the handles of his shopping bag.
One moment, Mr. Wayman. I seem to remember that our friend said you would be bringing me 4 pieces to consider.
Yes, but the 4th is just a bagatelle, a frippery, nothing more than a serograph. If I'd had a better sense beforehand of your preferences, I'd never have brought it.
But you have brought it. I see the end of the cardboard tube poking out of your bag, and you've roused my curiosity with what you say. I must remind you that I buy only by the lot.
Reluctantly, Mr. Wayman took the cardboard tube from the recumbent shopping bag, undid the knots of the plastic strip that bound the print to the tube, and unrolled the print.
He'd bought the print in the first days after the collapse of the market for what he'd then considered a song, considering its sales history. It had been a very famous work of art in its day. Schroeder crowed with pleasure. "Oh, Mr. Wayman, how droll! And of course I have just the thing to give you in exchange. The perfect barter." He went into his stockroom and returned with a can of Campbell's tomato soup. Oh, that's good. Oh, that's good. So it's like the end of the world and we know it. And people are trading artworks for canned food, and the guy brings in what's that one by Pollock? The Campbell's soup can painting. Um, I can see it in my eye. Warhol, not Pollock. Warhol. That's what I'm looking for. And he did a couple, I think. So yeah. So he brings in a Warhol print of Campbell's soup, like a lunatic. That's funny. Anyway, that is where we will call it for today. Next, I see you will be Friday, where we will continue reading through The Three Body Problem by Shishin Liu. We're at about the halfway point, and we'll see what we can get done on that. Excuse me. Next Monday, we will start reading through All You Need Is Kill by Hiroshi Sakurazaka, which is kind of like Armor if things got really, really weird. Less spacefaring and more. They discuss the plot point pretty early, but I don't want to spoil it too early. We'll be getting to that. I won't spoil the main plot conceit that it's got going on. You'll get that figured out. Yeah. And next Wednesday, maybe I'll make it a two-parter. I have to do some more organizing in any case, in order to put together this kind of not quite stream of consciousness ramble on a couple different things that'll interconnect a bit. And that may wind up being a two-parter, I don't know. After we get that done, whenever I get that done, will be Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Because somebody requested it, and I have a copy. My edition has like a 50-page introduction, which we'll be skipping, including notes on the text and a chronology of Mary Shelley's life. We'll be skipping that one. We will be doing the author's introduction to the standard novels edition, because that's not so long. And then we'll be reading the story. There's also, like, in my edition, an exceptionally dense appendix. Substantial variants between the texts of 1831 and 1818 are provided, together with a selection of significant revisions made by Percy Shelley at MS stage, which Mary Shelley adopted. Page and line numbers refer to passages cited from the present edition, and the relevant extracts shown in italics are abbreviated by ellipses where longer than 6 words. The 1831 reading is followed by that of the 1818, printed in Roman type. Material that was new in 1831 is followed by the comment, not in 1818. So we're going to just skip that in its entirety. There's also some short stories in this as well. Which I may do. that are they're short stories that are Frankenstein adjacent. There's A Fragment by Lord Byron. There's The Vampire, A Tale, which is by Dr. John William Polidori. I want to say there's another one in here. Which edition is this? This is a Penguin Books release, I think. Penguin Classics. So it's got considerable extra material lopped on. I have an older edition, not that old, but an older edition. I can't remember when that one is from. That doesn't have a lot of this extra stuff, so I figured I'd do this one instead. So with that, I'm going to scooch. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. If you didn't tune in and you're wondering why these are so rough, well, in the case of this one, it's because I was sight reading it. I have not read any of these stories before. That were contained in this Interzone interlude. Come on, go up. It's not loading pages. There we go. Good boy. Good machine. But otherwise, I read these live. Usually something I've read before. I read these live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, starting at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time or UTC -6. So you can tune in live if you want, or just listen to them after the fact. I generally update all my playlists at the end or beginning of every month. I do have to go through some of my older material and make sure that is set up in playlists. I want to say that there's at least one segment of, I think it's Axiomatic, which is one of the earliest short story collections I read, which is by Gregg. I think there's at least one of that is no longer available, and I'll see what I can do to retrieve that in some way, but it may not be possible. At any rate, everything is in their playlists, so you can check them out that way. I guess YouTube has a podcast feature, so I've thrown a couple things that are under the Creative Commons license into there. I don't know how any of that works. So if you're tuning in from one of those, well, you won't have been from this one, but hi. But yeah, hope people enjoy. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. Have a good one. Bye.